Alrighty. Hello, everyone. I am Catherine McKinnon, and I am the Volunteer Membership Coordinator for the Mount Shasta Bioregional Ecology Center. And today we have our Forest and Watershed Watch Program Manager with us here today, Nick Joslin. He is a fifth-generation Siskiyou County resident who has worked in road decommissioning, stream channel restoration, and environmental consulting. And he has his bachelor's in geologic sciences from University of Oregon. Thanks for being here with us today, Nick.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I think we have, and thanks for putting together the presentation. I think we can jump right into it. Just as a reminder to anyone who's watching, we are going to take questions at the end. So I'll check in the comments on Facebook. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to type those out there. So awesome. Let's go ahead here. Perfect. And I'm just gonna leave these here. All right, Nick, whenever you're ready, you can get started.
Okay, I just want to say as a note, I'm a geologist and a scientist, and I may misspeak or misrepresent some of the information here, and it's not my intention to be incorrect about any of the information. So I always welcome discussion, corrections, criticisms, addressing any errors I might make, and I'm looking forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you.
All right, next slide. So as you all know, California is in historic drought. 2021 marks the second year of below normal precipitation. I've listed some other notable historic drought years, and some of these dates will be important because significant water rights were granted during some of these drought times. This is an overview of the Shasta River watershed. You'll see that in the southwest, it's bounded by the Eddy Mountains, in the southeast by Mount Shasta. And right about in the lower center, you'll see Lake Shastina. Lake Shastina is a dam on the Shasta River that captures the upper watershed that includes Dale Creek, Eddy Creek, Bowles Creek, Bohan Creek, and a couple other small creeks. And the river flows basically south to north, kind of tracing a break in the geology where on the east side of the valley, it's newer volcanics, and on the west side of the valley is older Klamath Mountain accreted terrains. Next slide. This is a picture of a typical setting of the Shasta River in the middle of the valley. Next slide. Here's another picture that shows the meandering nature of the river. It is quite a windy river as it's a very low gradient. There's another picture a little bit higher up. You'll see just outside of the riparian zone, a lot of juniper and sage, typical habitat of the rain shadow of Mount Shasta. And you also see the bright yellow vegetation, which is willows. And then if you can see closely along the bank of the river, you'll see fence posts. Those are put up to keep cows out of the river. And in the background, in the background, you'll see Goose Nest, that peak that's visible on the east side of the valley. Next slide. This is a little overview of some terminology I'm going to use in describing the history of water rights. First, we'll have a riparian right. These are water rights established on the basis that an individual owns land that touches a water source. Then there's appropriated rights, where a water right that is claimed by an individual on the basis that the water will be used for beneficial purposes. These will either be pre-1914 or post-1914 appropriated water rights. Then there's adjudicated rights, which is a water right that is confirmed during a court adjudication process that analyzes the water claims of a number of users, the date they first used water, and confirms the amount of water they have the right to use for beneficial purposes with priority relative to other water users. Lastly, we have public trust, which is a concept being recently applied that states that a resource such as water is the property of all citizens. And the term diversion is the point where water is removed from a stream. This is a brief overview of the history of water rights in Northern California. Pre-US Spanish rule followed the rule of prior appropriation, whereby property rights were granted to those first to use a water source for beneficial means. The US took control of California in 1848 with the start of the gold rush. In 1855, the first appropriative water rights were upheld and the first water markets were set up for the sale of water to miners. Riparian and prior appropriated water rights clashed in 1886, resulting in a mixture of the two methods being recognized by the California Supreme Court. In Northern California, most water rights were used for mining. These claims to water, generally appropriated claims, were made by nailing a piece of paper to a tree at the point of your diversion. In 1872, due to difficulties in tracking the rights, there were changes made to the notification system. Around this time, mining in the Shasta Valley was also coming to an end. And as mining had dwindled, much of the mining infrastructure was converted to deliver water to agriculture. Examples of these old infrastructure are the Antonio Ditch and the Wairika Ditch. During these early days of water rights being issued, there was an effort to allow smaller scale users to obtain rights for beneficial uses. Simultaneously to that movement, there was a big land grab by the wealthy who knew they would also obtain the water rights based on first in time, first in right. Smaller users tried to create irrigation districts, and in 1887, the Wright Act created public irrigation districts. The 1872 law required counties to keep records of water rights where the public could see them. And these records were called the water books, and they're still at the courthouse today. And this picture is an example of what one of the pages would look like. Irrigated pasture for livestock and also vegetable production began in areas with a gentle slope where water could be delivered through ditches and the soil was good. These areas were the Little Shasta River region, Mount Shasta City, which was then known as Berryvale, Willow Creek area, and the Weed area. This slide shows the Shasta Valley irrigation in 1912, when about 13,400 acres were irrigated. In 1913, agricultural activity in the valley began to increase and demands for more water rights led to early conflicts. In 1914, the state changed what were seen to be weaknesses in the 1872 law, coupled with more scarcity of water, and developed a plan for orderly distribution of what was left. This is what is known as pre-1914 water rights, which can only have limited oversight by the state. Next slide. During this time, there were people who were involved sort of developing these water rights for the valley. Dr. George Dwinell bought land near Montague and began to offer parcels to homesteaders. This group became the Shasta Water Association, and they worked 3,600 acres with a right to 42 cubic feet a second of river water. In 1916, he tried to create another irrigation district with a water right of 100 cubic feet a second. At that point, other users became outraged, and he had to abandon the plan. In its place, the Grenada Irrigation District was formed with a water right of 40 CFS, but only drew 15 to begin. And in 1918, GID added pumps and increased their capacity to 40 CFS. This caused a collapse in the river level, leaving all downstream users without water for most of the summer. In 1921, the other users filed a request for a court adjudication of the water in the Shasta River. The adjudication came at a time of severe drought in the valley, and the state sent up a representative to try to keep the peace during the process. The Department of Public Works sent engineers up to map all diversions in the valley and came up with 199 individual hand-colored maps of water usage at that time. And this is a slide of one of those maps at the time. So you'll notice the green areas are irrigated areas that are claimed by the ranch families. The names you'll see in the map are some names of families who are still out there, or also have roads named after them. The adjudication process ran until 1932 and produced a document including names, priority, water quantity, points of diversions, seasons of use, and places of use. Nearly all were pre-1914, when new water laws took effect. Since 1932, new water rights have been granted. And in 1933, the Department of Public Works instituted water master services in the valley to oversee water distribution and keep the peace. Dr. Dwinell continued to develop water rights, and about 1925, he formed the Montague Irrigation District. In 1926, he began construction of Dwinell Dam. In 1927, Dr. Dwinell transferred water rights he had purchased earlier to form the Big Springs Irrigation District. This upset the downstream users. The mid-1920s were a period of significant drought in the valley. Long-standing families have stories of sleeping on their diversion structures to prevent dynamiting of them to let water flow to others downstream. And when the first voluntary water mastering effort was underway between 1924 and 1931, most people were cooperative, but some weren't. In 1926, along with all of the other problems, a railroad tank car full of crude oil fell off a bridge over Bulls Creek near Weed, and it contaminated the water to the point that livestock couldn't drink it. Next slide. The Montague Irrigation District paid for its infrastructure with bonds that were sold nationwide. All the private property within the district was put up as collateral, and some people believed that their names had been forged on the mortgage documents and blamed Dr. Dwinell. The Montague Water Conservation District was unable to meet its payments on the bonds and was forced with possible foreclosure and loss of all the members' lands. It seemed that Dr. Dwinell was essentially ran out of the county on a rail, never to return. And eventually the district settled with the bondholders for 10 cents on the dollar. And the reservoir finally filled up for the first time in the early 1940s. This is an aerial view of Dwinell Reservoir, now called Lake Shastina. In the late 1980s, the Big Springs Irrigation District switched from using water from Big Springs to wells, and this eliminated water master oversight that had left them without irrigation some of the years. Despite the major efforts made to settle and organize water rights throughout the adjudication, the troubles were not gone. Pre-adjudication water rights and riparian rights were not subject to water master control, making close management difficult or impossible at times. And decades later, improved pumps and greater financial resources led to the use of groundwater for additional irrigation, decreasing flows from springs, feeding the river, and impacting domestic wells. As yet, no water has been set aside for in-stream flows to protect public trust resources, creating the potential future litigation, which hovers in the background. This slide shows the change in irrigated acreage from 1921 to 2010. And you'll notice in the 1921 slide, most of the irrigation was still taking place in the valley bottoms, very close to the river. But by 2010, because of irrigation efficiencies, better pumps, more ditches, better irrigation systems, the land that was irrigated had increased dramatically. So what comes next in water management for the Shasta Valley? Surface water users are still essentially bound by the original laws and rights that they received in the early 1900s. And the state's only recently begun to study and manage groundwater in the state. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that was passed in 2014 created local groups to develop a method of understanding and managing groundwater in a sustainable manner. That process is currently underway in the Shasta Valley, as well as the Scott Valley and the Butte Valley. In the Shasta Valley, the underlying geology presents added complexities to understanding the groundwater system. Volcanic aquifers are extremely complex systems with water quick to exit the system and also quick to return. The Shasta River is directly connected to groundwater via large springs and inflows within the channel itself. And the pumping of groundwater near the river can and does affect the flow of the river. As surface waters are already greatly overpromised to irrigators, more ranchers have begun to drill wells. Wells are much less regulated than surface waters. No wells are metered to know how much water is actually being extracted, and fluctuations in the river levels can sometimes be attributed to a nearby large volume pump being turned on. The water master has little to no authority to require coordination with individual well owners. Where are we today with respect to water use during the most dry water year on record in the Shasta Valley? The river is hurting. Irrigation and the growing of alfalfa has basically largely been unaffected this year. This picture is taken near the mouth of the river about, well, 3 weeks ago, where the flow was measured at 3.5 CFS. Unlike in some rivers, the Shasta has never had a minimum in-stream flow amount set by the state. This means that in some years, almost all of the river water is used to grow food for cows. This is despite years of work and $80 million being spent to protect the endangered species that rely on water for their survival. The suitable habitat that a fish can survive has continued to shrink despite habitat enhancement work and flow enhancement work by conservation groups and the state. Recognizing the threat to the survival of coho, chinook, steelhead, and other aquatic life, the Department of Fish and Wildlife finally recommended to the State Water Resources Control Board that an emergency base flow be maintained to protect these species. This is a historic ask by the agency, Fish and Wildlife, who's tasked with the protection of wildlife in the state. The Water Board now has the task of determining how to develop such an emergency flow regulation. So it's new legal ground in this arena because the state is now going to have to figure out how to regulate senior water rights. But the precedent that was just set in 2020 in a case called Stanford-Vena Irrigation District versus the state of California, the court ruled that the irrigation district must curtail their diversions in certain times of the year in order to protect the endangered species in the aquatic habitat of a small tributary of the Sacramento River. There have been several webinars that the state water boards held to help all interested parties understand the complexities of the new emergency regulation. And many water users who have held that their water rights cannot be curtailed now expect to have their rights reduced in order to maintain the emergency base flow. This kind of sets up a situation with the haves versus the have-nots. Riparian and pre-1914 water rights holders have senior rights that prevent state regulation without compensation for changes. Junior water rights holders are the first to lose water during curtailments. And if a junior water rights holder wanted to voluntarily give up water during low flow events, that water could be used by the senior rights holders. It leads to an economic imbalance where the largest landowners have the most senior water rights and generally suffer much less economic hardships than junior water rights holders. So with an unprecedented diversion curtailment looming over irrigators in the Shasta Valley, the Water Board indicates its firm belief that a single irrigator is claiming riparian rights, where for much of its irrigated land, no such right appears to exist. This is essentially theft of water. And so illegal use of water should be the first place to look to be cut back. Next slide. There are two main pathways the state believes are available: voluntary actions or enforcement of curtailment. And it's likely going to end up being a blend of both, because there are some groups out in the valley who are willing to collaboratively look at manners which they might stop using water early, but there are other users who believe their water rights are untouchable. It now seems pretty promising that a new manner of water management could come out of this emergency regulation. We will have a better understanding of how effective the extra water in the river will be for fish when the earliest fall Chinook salmon usually appear at the mouth by the first week of September. Typically, irrigation rights extend till October 1st. And historically, fall Chinook arrived even earlier than September. And before Dwinelle Dam, spring Chinook arrived in the middle of the summer. And that's a uniquely identified separate species that are no longer found in the river. This is a picture of spawning salmon in the Shasta River. This is a shot of the Shasta River in its canyon stretch, which is where it meets the Klamath River. Quite a different setting than the valley setting. It's in a deep canyon. It gets really warm. It's a lot rockier, and the fish basically have to make it through this stretch to get to better spawning grounds in the low gradient sections. I've had some people email and ask how you can monitor the flow levels of the Shasta River. And there are several gauges in place on the river that are live time measurements. You can click these links. We'll put this PowerPoint presentation up on the website. You can click on these links. So this first link is near the mouth. And this gauge is just upstream of where the Shasta River meets the Klamath. The next gauge is near Montague. And this gauge is commonly considered to be downstream of the largest diverters. The next gauge, the Grenada Pump Station, is maintained by the state. And this gauge is above almost all large diverters and shows how much water exists in the river below Dwinelle Dam. This is almost entirely spring water because very little water gets released out of Dwinelle. So if you use these gauges, what you can see is at the Grenada Pump Station, there's usually around 70 cubic feet a second. And at the Montague gauge this summer, there's been an average of around 20 cubic feet a second. The Wairika gauge this summer, there's been an average of around 15 cubic feet a second. So between the Grenada Pump Station gauge and Montague, there's usually 50 plus cubic feet a second of water removed from the river for irrigation. And just below the Montague gauge, there's another 5 to 10 cubic feet that are removed for irrigation. These three gauges only tell part of the story because they fail to account for the flow that is diverted above Dwinelle Dam. They don't measure any of Parks Creek or Big Springs Creek, and they miss a couple of other diversions that occur below Dwinelle Dam. So some estimate the natural flow of the river midsummer prior to Dwinelle Dam would have been 100 to 200 cubic feet a second. The gauges also fail to account for groundwater extraction near the river. The summer has been some of the lowest flows ever measured in the river. In late May, it was apparent that the river was already showing low flow levels. And a poorly planned experiment was run to flush young salmonids from the river and into the toxic Klamath where a large fish die-off was occurring. After this pulsed flow, irrigation pumping and diverting nearly dried up the river at the Montague gauge. 4.7 CFS was measured. If any juvenile salmonids were left in the river at that point, it's likely they would have died in the low warm water. Could it get worse? On July 6th, the Wairika gauge began to drop and finally bottomed out at 3.5 cubic feet a second. This leaves a lot of questions unanswered about the management strategies that have failed to protect the river. This has finally led to the emergency regulation that I spoke about earlier, which is in the works right now. This is one last slide just showing the river as it winds through one of the ranches. And I think that's it for the PowerPoint.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. It looks like we have a question. Let's see here. So one of the questions we received is there anything happening to set aside water in the stream for aquatic organisms?
That's happening right now. That's the emergency regulation I was speaking about. In May, Fish and Wildlife recommended to the Water Board that the Scott and Shasta River both have base flows guaranteed to be left in the river. And they outlined a 12-month schedule of those flows. It's different for both rivers. But in the Shasta, the Fish and Wildlife wants to see 50 CFS at the mouth. So at that gauge that's near Wairika, they want that to be reading 50 CFS through the end of the summer, and then it will slowly actually ramp up to over 100 by late fall.
Thank you. Let me see. Has there been any work going on in the Shasta Valley to preserve the fish, and what organizations have been a part of that or have opposed that? Maybe what's been going on with that?
Beginning in about the late 90s, the focus began to be put on the endangered species that lived in the river, and work began to initially just exclude cattle from the river. And this was basically fencing sections of the river near where cattle were grazing. And it was done by local groups, one of which is the Shasta Valley Resource Conservation District. And as that work evolved, they realized that that wouldn't necessarily be enough. And they started to look at other ways to improve the way ranchers diverted water from the streams. They started to look for ways to exclude fish from ending up down irrigation ditches at dead ends where they would usually die. And so those projects started to get more and more expensive. And probably in the early 2000s, conservation groups, Cow Trout's one of them, Nature Conservancy is another, all began to seek funding from different grants to help the ranchers improve their diversion structures, increase their efficiencies of water use. The Shasta Valley Resource Conservation District was also still really involved at this time. And they've succeeded in spending quite a lot of money out there, and yet the fish counts have continued to decline during this entire time.
Thank you. And I know a pretty common question is related to cannabis in the Shasta Valley. Does that have anything to do with illegal water use, or what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, that has become a hot topic, and it's hard to exactly portray the way it works. There's a rancher, or there's at least one rancher who has some water rights, but then there's also groundwater users who have been selling water to cannabis growers. None of the use would be considered, I think, reasonable or beneficial by the state. And I think even the county has begun a process to ask that the state declare it unreasonable. The ranchers have kind of fought back. Well, the ranchers selling the water have fought back because they don't think that it's illegal what they're doing. But the other ranchers who have water rights are starting to believe that the use for cannabis is actually affecting the flow of the river. It's an ongoing battle. The county is now in a federal lawsuit regarding the trucking of water to cannabis grows. And it's something that probably will not be resolved anytime soon.
And so it sounds like, from what I was hearing during the presentation, so the average person can kind of just be vigilant and watch the gauges. Is that what you would recommend for somebody who's interested in participating in some way?
Yeah, I think right now presents a unique opportunity because the state is essentially giving the irrigators a chance to show whether they want to do this voluntarily or not. And so when you start watching these gauges, if you were just to start watching them now, what you would hope to see is by the time the regulation is handed down by the state, that the flows should increase. That would happen if there was a voluntary action that was actually sufficient enough to get the water to where the state wants it to be, 50 cubic feet a second. And if we don't see that happen, I think we will see the state have to move into the second phase of the regulation, which would be some type of enforcement, which I'm not even sure they have imagined how that would take place. Water masters kind of only have guidance over some of the water rights holders. And usually those water rights holders are willing to cooperate, but the riparian users and other senior water rights holders might still be left believing they cannot be curtailed. And that 2020 case, which set precedent where the state asked or told a senior water rights holder to curtail, is sort of what looks like it would set up to happen in the Shasta Valley as well.
Looks like we have another question. This question is from Linda Webb. She asked the previous question as well. So it says, you mentioned groundwater planning. Is the public involved in that process, or will we be in the future?
Right now, the Sigma process is in kind of in an advisory time. The public can participate, but the plan is being developed by members of the public, members of irrigation districts, other private well owners, and that plan will have to be submitted to the state. And at that point, the public will be able to read the actual final plan and comment on it. And that timeline is coming up shortly. I believe sometime in September, the county will make that the first draft available for public comment.
Awesome. Thank you. Let me see if there's any last questions here. Well, it looks like that's all for questions for now. Yeah, I just want to thank you, Nick, for putting together that informative and engaging presentation. I hope that anybody who's watching was able to learn something. And I think we'll wrap up. Do you have any kind of closing comments or anything like that?
Feel free to reach out to me. I think we'll post my email address somehow. It's nick@mountShastaEcology.org. Ask me any questions you want. It's a really ongoing, dynamic process. A lot of people who have been fighting for the fish for a long time are pretty optimistic to at least see the state take its first measures towards what looks like it could be substantial protective measure. There's still a lot of work to be done. There's still a lot of work in the works to happen out there. There's a lot of ranch owners who want to help, and there's a lot of ranch owners who are less willing to help. So it kind of ties together this whole lifestyle and tradition argument with an argument for water for fish, but also even just water for the river, water for the public to use. And it just represents kind of an exciting time where we'll see after, let's see, 175, 180 years of settlers being in the valley, if we can finally sort of treat the river with a little bit more respect and see if adding water is actually going to help the fish.
Yeah, awesome. And it sounds like September, you said, is when folks might be able to comment on what the county puts out, correct?
Yeah, and that's for groundwater. So
okay,
that's, the tricks of it all is that this emergency regulation is for surface water, which is how most people out there irrigate. But there are people who irrigate with groundwater. And what the county plan is for groundwater. And the Shasta River is considered an interconnected river where the groundwater and the surface water are pretty much connected. So it's kind of unknown yet how it plays out with respect to Sigma, which is sort of an advisory scheme that's going to take a long time to develop the recommendations, and sort of relies on the first 5 years being mainly just study and data collection. But the surface water stuff is happening right now. So at some point, all of this is going to have to be tied together, and hoping that it's sooner than later, because it's pretty apparent that the pumping is having an effect on the river. And so to just have regulatory structures that control surface water would actually incentivize people to move to groundwater, which is not exactly what you want to do in a system where the groundwater is so tied to the surface water. So it's really a tricky place, not only legally, but for people out there who rely on the water, the ranchers. I mean, it's you know, I think in the history part, I described some of the kind of infighting and battles between neighbors and ranchers downstream from one another. That still kind of plays out right now in the valley, where a water master can run around and control some of the irrigation districts who are junior rights holders, but she can't really tell the senior rights holders or even know what they're doing. She can't really demand that they stop. And so the fighting kind of has never really stopped out there when it comes
because
to
these folks are on private property, correct? So that's kind of part of the difficulty, is that
it's basically all on private property. So there's almost no public access to the river anywhere until it's out of the valley, and kind of, I guess, I mean, there's very little public access.
Yeah.
And so even the water master can't, you know, go up and check on some of these other ranchers to see what they're doing. It puts them in a really tough position, and they're really ultimately just there for the protection of irrigation water. There really isn't somebody who's protecting the water for the fish. So the state's finally stepping into that role, and in a region where government regulation is sort of looked at with a skeptical eye, it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, awesome. Well, if anybody who's watching this, remember you can email Nick. I will put his email inside of the description of this video. And if you'd like to donate to our efforts here at the Ecology Center or volunteer with us, these are all things that we would love for you to do. You can visit www.mountshastaecology.org. I will also put the link in the description of this video. And if you haven't already signed up for our newsletter, that's a great way to stay updated. And so I'll link that in the description as well for anybody who would like to do that. So thanks again, Nick. It was a great presentation, and I hope everybody enjoyed watching.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.